The book chapters are Fethullah Gulen's, I'm using him as a sort of typical Islamic scholar, taking his ideas and comparing him with Plato, Confucius, Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mill, and Jean-Paul Sartre on 5 key issues. Issues that I think are just fundamental, issues that I think we have to think about as we set up our world, we set up our communities, and go forward into the 21st century. Issues like inherent human dignity, and moral worth, freedom, particularly freedom of thought and conscience, of religion and expression, education. What is the ideal humanity? What is our vision of ideal humanity when we try to educate people? What are we shooting for? When we try to create our societies, what are we looking for? What's our vision of the ideal? And then responsibility. Who's responsible for this? Is it fate? Will it just happen or not? Or is it us? And so these are the main themes, and I put Gulen into conversation with these other philosophers, major world philosophers, from different times, different periods, different cultures, different languages, different religions, particularly in the case of someone like Gulen and Sartre. Sartre's an atheist. He's an atheist French existentialist. Gulen is a contemporary Muslim, traditional Muslim theist, a scholar, a believer in God. Gulen, in his writing and in his preaching, has had some rather harsh things to say about atheism and existentialism and as a system, not about people, but as a system. Sartre has some pretty harsh things to say about religious belief systems. So it's not like they're holding hands and singing Kumbaya. But on this issue of responsibility, there's profound resonance there. People who, these two systems of thought are radically different, coming from completely different starting points, and yet on this one theme, there's profound connection, and there's workability there. So that's what I've tried to do, is find these points of connection between these radically different systems. The point, of course, it's one thing to do this on the pages of a book. Those of us in academia, we're trained to do this, Dogs bark, fish swim, scholars write books. We can do this, right? Fine. But the real challenge is for us not to do it just on the pages of a book, for us to do it in life, in our lives. For me to do it in my life. For you to do it in your life. For us as a community. For you all here in Kansas, for us down in Texas, for us here in the United States, to do that as a people. That's the real challenge. How will we live together amidst radical difference? I think that's the central challenge of our era. What if we never agree? What if we never practice the same religion, all of us? In fact, we won't. We are destined, given our 21st century reality, where it's a global village in many ways. We are living at a time in history where we are more connected through mass communications, mass travel, mass media than we've ever been. We're up with each other. We're sort of in each other's space in ways that we've never been historically because of technology. So we're confronted with that difference in powerful ways. And it presents us with a very unique challenge. And I think the future of our common life as a people, not only in this country but on the planet, really hinges on how we go about answering this question. We will never all believe in the same God. We will never all share the same basic values. We will never have, all of us, the same basic worldview. But we are destined to live together. How will we do that? What's the plan? So that's where I'm living right there. And you wouldn't be here in these seats if some part of you wasn't living there as well, if you weren't living there as well. So I commend you for that, and I'm glad to see you. And this is very much a work in progress for me. It's very much a an inquiry. It's a live inquiry for me as a scholar, but as a citizen, you know, just living. Of how do we do this structurally, socially, politically, otherwise, but also how do I do it? How do each of us, how do we do this? What kind of inner capacities do I need to develop in myself? And maybe you could develop them too, that allow me a level of comfort with radical difference. When I encounter people who are radically different from me, and they will never think the way I do. They will never vote for the same people I vote for. They will never, ever see the world the way I see it. But I am destined to share the planet with them. Who do I need to be to make peaceful coexistence work? Right there. So, that's about it. That's about all I have to say about that. So I'm happy to have any kind of questions or comments that you have about that.
Well, I have tons of questions, but how does Gulen answer that question that you just posed from within the traditional Islamic framework?
Well, he says that traditional Islam really has no problem with it. First of all, it has no problem with the question. And secondly, that it has to do with being committed to humanity. Not only Muslim humanity, but all humanity. That all of humanity is made in the image of God, of the whole cosmos. And so there's a strong emphasis in his ideas on service to humanity, giving, hospitality, strong emphasis on altruism. Strong emphasis on altruism and service. Those are dominant themes in his work, and it's completely rooted in an Islamic framework.
And there's room for the secular in there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It doesn't mean that, you know, over pots of strong Turkish tea there won't be debates about, you know, atheism and God and all of that. But that's just healthy in terms of living together. Absolutely. For sure.
Yeah, I have a question. And if you indulge, it's going to be quite a long question. I don't want to dominate the Q&A answer. This session here is quite good. But talking about secularism and Turkey, and I like your dichotomy very much. This all the same versus different, and it seems to kind of contextualize your argument pretty well. Being able to live with each other and share the world. But you can think of other dichotomies. For instance, as far as Gulen is concerned, who I know pretty well, who I know of pretty well. Another dichotomy that might apply is authenticity versus ambiguity. One of the reasons I bring that up because a lot of the egalitarian and humanistic ideas that you talk about in regard to Gulen is recent. It's about 10 to 12 years old. If you look at Gulen's past work, you realize that he's been very critical of Christianity. He's been very critical of any other faith other than Islam. And there's some other facts that are intriguing about it. For instance, he's only an elementary school graduate. And some of the philosophers that you kind of put in conversation with him, Plato, Confucius, Stuart, these are probably a little better educated than he is. More so than that, there's other stuff about Gulen that kind of call into question his authenticity about brotherhood and Interfaith dialogue. For instance, record for calling Vatican the snake. He's on record for describing his high school lighthouses that are like a web, and like the students are like the spider. They lure the young into the web. We show him the world. We show him he lost his way. He calls traditional public schools, talking about education, for instance, parasites, blood cancers, torsion horses. These are all from his own writings from early 1990s.
Some of those I would, yeah. I mean,
if I may just finish. I know it's a long question. I'm not here
it is.
Fast, but
and you should ask the students to let you give a lecture.
I know. I'm not trying to give a lecture, but the reason why I'm bringing this up is because oftentimes when people like me, who's not necessarily in favor of Gulen, when we bring these kinds of up here or in Turkey, we're suddenly, very quickly labeled hardline secularists, Kemalists, pro-military, rigid, elitist, judicial people. And it's so hard to kind of stay away from that label. But recently, I mean, this is specifically in regards to your book, and here's recently, a lot of other countries, like Uzbekistan, like Russia, are prohibiting his schools. And maybe those countries are not model democracies in the Western sense, but for instance, in the Netherlands, very recently, the Christian Democrat, Labour, and Conservative parties all agreed to freeze his funds and to inquire into his activities because a couple of his defectors and other leaders kind of came out on TV and called the Dutch filthy, blasphemous infidels. The best Dutchman is one who has converted to Islam. All the Dutch must be made Muslim. This is like a few years ago. And what I'm reading to you is from 2008. So, how do you account for this kind of controversial side of Gulen when we talk about this brotherhood and all this other stuff? And if dichotomy is really about all the same versus different and how to live without differences, I believe being able to live with differences rests upon authenticity first. If I think somebody's different from me or the same, doesn't really matter. I must first believe that they are authentic in what they say. So that's a fundamental dichotomy. I think your dichotomy is kind of evading other dichotomy. And I think people living together must be first honest. So how do you account for that in your book?
I don't disagree with you at all in terms of people living together must be honest. And I don't see any kind of contradiction at all between one that you lay out of authenticity versus ambiguity versus the one that I have picked. The dichotomy that I have picked is one that's very dominant in interfaith study and work, and so that's where I'm coming from on this. And so it was, I judged right for me to choose that dichotomy since it's very much alive in the particular area. One of the things that I have learned, and I do not claim to be an expert on Gulen by any stretch of the imagination, one of the things that I learned very quickly when researching Gulen's work and the impact of the people who were inspired by his ideas, is that you have to look very closely at sources for information about Gulen. And there are very strident, rival voices claiming to have authoritative knowledge and about him. And just please.
How about his own writings?
Please, just let me finish.
His own stuff.
Please. And there are, he was under investigation and under charges for many years in Turkey, and much of that stuff was so-called tapes and quotes and things from him directly were shown to be forgeries, were shown to be mock-ups. And so I, myself, have learned to be very leery of those things. I am not one who is given to labeling those who question religious movements like Gulen's, that you're just automatically a rabid secularist and shouting you down. I think that's, the situation in Turkey is very complex with regard to that. Turkey's history borrowing the philosophy of laïcité from France, and the kind of secularism that is practiced in Turkey versus the kind that we have here, they are very, very different. Very different forms of secularism. And I, as a person, as an American, as a scholar, I do not prefer laïcism. And so I think much of the criticism of Gulen has come from within a laïcistic perspective. And from within that perspective, the criticism makes sense. But I think the whole perspective is illegitimate.
But I think the perspective you're talking about, I mean, you're not referring to his own writings. I'm not talking about...
I would need to say, the thing is that I find a lot of those quotes that you're talking about, and I'm not going to go through them and tick them down. I have real questions as to the authenticity of the sources of those. I also think that that Gulen is like any other scholar who has and I'm using the word very loosely. I mean, Socrates wasn't educated either in the way that I am, or maybe you are, in terms of PhDs. Neither was Confucius or Plato. So I'm using that term very loosely. But he's a human being whose work has changed.